Bleak House by Charles Dickens, Chapter 32, The Appointed Time. It is night in Lincoln's Inn, and fat candles are snuffed out in offices, and clerks have rattled down the crazy wooden stairs and dispersed. The bell that rings at 9 o'clock has ceased its doleful clangor about nothing. The gates are shut, and the night porter, a solemn warder with a mighty power of sleep, keeps guard in his lodge. In dirty upper casements, here and there, hazy little patches of candlelight reveal where some wise draftsman and conveyancer yet toils for the entanglement of real estate in meshes of sheepskin, in the average ratio of about a dozen sheep to an acre of land. In the neighboring court, where the Lord Chancellor of the rag and bottle shop dwells, there is a general tendency toward beer and supper. Now there is a sound of putting up shop shutters in the court, and a smell as of the smoking of pipes, and shooting stars are seen in upper windows, further indicating retirement to rest. Now, too, the policeman begins to push at doors, to try fastenings, to be suspicious of bundles, and to administer his beat on the hypothesis that everyone is either robbing or being robbed. It is a close night, though the damp cold is searching too, and there is a laggard mist a little way up in the air. It's a fine, steaming night to turn the slaughterhouses and the unwholesome trades, the sewage, bad water, and burial grounds to account, and give the registrar of deaths some extra business. It may be something in the air, there is plenty of it, or it may be something in himself that is the fault of Mr. Weevil, otherwise Jobling, is very ill at ease. He comes and goes between his own room and the open street door 20 times an hour. He has been doing it ever since it fell dark, since the Chancellor shut up his shop, which he did very early tonight. Mr. Weevil has been down and up and down and up, with a cheap, tight velvet skull cap on his head, making his whiskers look out of all proportion, oftener than before. It is no phenomenon that Mr. Snagsby should be ill at ease too, for he is always so, more or less, under the oppressive influence of the secret that is upon him, impelled by the mystery of which he is a partaker, and yet in which he is not a sharer. Mr. Snagsby haunts what seems to be its fountainhead, the rag and bottle shop in the court. It has an irresistible attraction for him, even now, coming round by the Saul's Arms, with the intention of passing down the court and out at the Chancery Lane end. Mr. Snagsby approaches. "What, Mr. Weevil?" says the stationer, stopping to speak. "Are you there?" "Aye," says Weevil. "I am here, Mr. Snagsby." "Airing yourself as I am doing before you go to bed?" "Why, there's not much air to be got here, and what there is not very freshening," Mr. Weevil answers. "Very true, sir. Don't you observe," says Mr. Snagsby, pausing to sniff and taste the air a little, "that you're not to put too fine a point on it, that you're rather greasy here, sir? Why, I have noticed myself that there is a queer kind of flavour in the place tonight," Mr. Weevil rejoins. "I suppose it's chops at the Soul's Arms." "Chops, you think? Oh, chops, eh?" Mr. Snagsby sniffs and tastes again. "Well, sir, I suppose it is, but I should say their cook at the Soul wanted a little looking after. She has been burning 'em, sir, and I don't think—" Mr. Snagsby sniffs and tastes again, and then spits and wipes his mouth. "I don't think they were quite fresh when they were shown the gridiron." "That's very likely. It's a tainting sort of weather." "It is a tainting sort of weather," says Mr. Snagsby, "and I find it sinking to the spirits. By George, I find it gives me the horrors." And we'll pronounce this the way it's written. It's Mr. Weevely, returns Mr. Weevely. "When you see you live in a lonesome way, and in a lonesome room with black curtains hanging over it," says Mr. Snagsby, falling back a step to look up at the house. "I couldn't live in that room alone as you do, sir. I should get so fidgety and worried of an evening sometimes that I should be driven to come to the door and stand here sooner than sit there. But then, it's very true. You didn't see in your room what I saw there. That makes a difference." "I know quite enough about it," returns Tony. "It's not agreeable, is it?" pursues Mr. Snagsby, coughing his cough of mild persuasion behind his hand. "Mr. Crook ought to consider it in the rent. I hope he does, I am sure." "I hope he does," says Tony, "but I doubt it." You find the rent too high, do you, sir?" returns the stationer. "Rents are high about here. I don't know how it is exactly, but the law seems to put things up in price. Not that I mean to say a word against the profession I get my living by." Mr. Weaveley again glances up and down the court, and then looks at the stationer. Mr. Snagsby, blankly catching his eye, looks upward for a star or so, and coughs a cough expressive of not exactly seeing his way out of the conversation. "It is a curious fact, sir," he observes, slowly rubbing his hands, "that he should have been—" "Who's he?" interrupts Mr. Weaveley. "The deceased, you know," says Mr. Snagsby, twitching his head and right eyebrow toward the staircase. "Ah, to be sure," returns the other, as if he were not over fond of the subject. "I thought we had done with him." "I was only going to say it's a curious fact, sir, that he should have come and lived here and been one of my writers, and that you should come and live here and be one of my writers too." "It is a curious coincidence, as you say," answers Weaveley, once more glancing up and down the street. "Seems a fate in it, don't there?" suggests the stationer. "There does." "Just so," observes the stationer with his confirmatory cough. "Quite a fate in it, quite a fate. Well, Mr. Weaveley, I am afraid I must bid you good night. My little woman will be looking for me else. Good night, sir." If Mr. Snagsby hastens home to save his little woman the trouble of looking for him, he might set his mind at rest on that score. His little woman has had her eye upon him round the Saul's arms all this time, and now glides after him with a pocket handkerchief wrapped over her head, honoring Mr. Weaveley and his doorway with a searching glance as she goes past. "You'll know me again, ma'am, at all events," says Mr. Weaveley to himself, "and I can't complain that you—" "You'll know me again, ma'am, at all events," says Mr. Weaveley to himself, "and I can't compliment you on your appearance, whoever you are, with your head tied up in a bundle. Is this fellow never coming?" This fellow approaches as he speaks. Mr. Weaveley softly holds up his finger and draws him into the passage and closes the street door. Then they go upstairs, Mr. Weaveley heavily and Mr. Guppy, for it is he, very lightly indeed. When they are shut into the back room, they speak low. "I thought you had gone to Jericho at least, instead of coming here," says Tony. "Why, I said about 10. "You said about 10, Tony repeats. "Yes, so you did, about 10, but according to my count, it's 10 times 10. It's 100 o'clock. I never had such a night in my life." "What has been the matter?" "That's it," says Tony. "Nothing has been the matter, but here have I been stewing and fuming in this jolly old crib till I have had the horrors falling on me as thick as hail." "Why, what's the matter with you, Tony?" inquires Mr. Guppy, looking at him as he sits down with his elbow on the table. "William Guppy," replies the other, "I am in the Downs. It's this unbearably dull, suicidal room, and old Bogui downstairs, I suppose." Mr. Weaveley leans his head on his hand, puts his feet on the fender, and looks at the fire. Mr. Guppy slightly tosses his head and sits down on the other side of the table in an easy attitude. "Wasn't that Snagsby talking to you, Tony?" "Yes, and B.S. it was Snagsby," says Mr. Weaveley, altering the construction of his sentence. "On business?" "No. He was only sauntering by and stopped to prose." "I thought it was Snagsby," says Mr. Guppy, "and thought it as well that he shouldn't see me, so I waited till he was gone." "There we go again, William G.," cried Tony, looking up for an instant. "So mysterious and secret. By George, if we were going to commit a murder, we couldn't have more mystery about it. Mr. Guppy affects the smile, and, with the view of changing the conversation, looks with an admiration real or pretended round the room at the Galaxy Gallery of British beauty, terminating his surgery with the portrait of Lady Dedlock over the mantel-shelf, in which she is represented on a terrace, with a pedestal upon the terrace, and a vase upon the pedestal, and her shawl upon the vase, and a bracelet on her arm. "That's very like Lady Dedlock," says Mr. Guppy. "It's a speaking likeness." "I wish it was," growled Tony, without changing his position. "I should have some fashionable conversation here, then," finding by this time that his friend is not to be wheedled into a more sociable humour. Mr. Guppy puts about upon the ill-used tack and remonstrates with him. "Tony," he says, "I can make allowances for lowness of spirits, for no man knows what it is when he does come upon a man better than I do, and no man perhaps has a better right to know it than does a man who has an unrequited image imprinted on his art. But there are bounds to these things when an unoffending party is in question, and I will acknowledge to you, Tony, that I don't think your manner on the present occasion is hospitable or quite gentlemanly." "This is strong language, William Guppy," returns Mr. Weasley. "Sir, it may be so," retorts Mr. Guppy, "but I feel strongly when I use it." Mr. Weasley admits that he has been writing and begs Mr. William Guppy to think no more about it. Mr. William Guppy, however, having got the advantage, cannot release it without a little more injured remonstrance. "No, dash it, Tony," says the gentleman, "you really ought to be careful how you wound the feelings of a man who has an unrequited image imprinted on his art, and who is not altogether happy in those chords which vibrate to the tenderest emotions. You, Tony, possess in yourself all that is calculated to charm the eye and allure the taste. It is not your character to hover around one flower. The old garden is open to you, and your airy pinions carry you through it. Still, Tony, far be it from me, I am sure, to wound even your feelings without a cause." "And now," says Tony, stirring the fire, touching the same bundle of letters, "isn't it an extraordinary thing of Crook to have appointed 12 o'clock tonight to hand him over to me?" "Very. What did he do it for?" "What did he do anything for? He don't know. Said today was his birthday, and he'd hand him over tonight at 12 o'clock. He'll have drunk himself blind by that time. He has been at it all day." "He hasn't forgotten the appointment, I hope." "Forgotten? Trust him for that. He never forgets anything. I saw him tonight, about 8, helped him shut up his shop, and he had got the letters then in his hairy cap. He pulled it off and showed 'em me when the shop was closed. He took them out of his cap, hung his cap on the chair back, and stood turning them over before the fire. I heard him a little while afterward through the floor, humming like the wind, the only song he knows, about Bibbo and old Chiron, and Bibbo being drunk when he died. He has been as quiet since as an old rat asleep in his hole." "And are you to go down at 12? "At 12? And, as I tell you, when you came, it seemed to me 100. "Tony," says Mr. Guppy, considering a little with his legs crossed, "he can't read yet, can he?" "Read? He'll never read. He can make all the letters separately, and he knows most of them separately when he sees them. He has got on that much under me, but he can't put them together. He's too old to acquire the knack of it now, and too drunk. Tony," says Mr. Guppy, uncrossing and recrossing his legs, "how do you suppose he spelt out the name of Hawdon?" "He never spelt it out. You know what a curious power he has, and how he has been used to employ himself in enjoying things by eye, in copying things by eye alone. He imitated it, evidently, from the direction of a letter, and asked me what it meant. Tony," says Mr. Guppy, uncrossing and recrossing his legs again, "should you say that the original was a man's writing or a woman's?" "A woman's, 50 to 1 a lady's. Slopes a good deal, and the end of the letter N long and hasty." Mr. Guppy had been biting his thumbnail during this dialogue. As he is going to do so again, he happens to look at his coat sleeve. It takes his attention. He stares at it aghast. Why, Tony, what on earth is going on in this house tonight? Is there a chimney on fire? See how the soot's falling. Here, look at my arm. See again on the table here. Confound the stuff, it won't blow off. Smears like black fat. They look at one another, and Tony goes listening to the door, and a little ways upstairs and a little ways downstairs, comes back and says it's all right and all quiet, and quotes the remark he lately made to Mr. Snagsby about their cooking chops at Sol's Arms. And it was then, resumes Mr. Guppy, still glancing with remarkable aversion at his coat sleeve, as they pursue their conversation with their heads very near together, that he told you of his having taken the bundle of letters from his lodger's portmanteau. That was the time, sir, answers Toby, faintly adjusting his whiskers, whereupon I wrote a line to my dear boy, the Honourable William Guppy, informing him of the appointment for tonight, and advising him not to call before Bogey being a sly boots. The light, vivacious tone of fashionable life, which is usually assumed by Mr. Weevely, sits so ill upon him tonight that he abandons that and his whiskers together, and, after looking over his shoulder, appears to yield himself up a prey to the horrors again. You are to bring the letters to your room and read and compare, and to get yourself into a position to tell him all about them. That's the arrangement, isn't it, Tony? Asked Mr. Guppy. You can't speak too low. Yes, that's what he and I agreed. I tell you what, Tony, you can't speak too low, says Tony once more. Mr. Guppy nods his sagacious head, advances it closer, and drops into a whisper. I tell you what, the first thing to be done is to make another packet like the real one, so that if he should ask to see the real one while it's in my possession, you can show him the dummy. And suppose he detects the dummy as soon as he sees it, which, with his biting screw of an eye, is about 500 times more likely than not, suggests Tony. Then we'll face it out. They don't belong to him, and they never did. You found that, and you placed them in my hands, a legal friend of yours, for security. If he forces us to it, they'll be producible, won't they? Yes, is Mr. Weevely's reluctant admission. Why, Tony, remonstrates his friend, how you look! You don't doubt William Guppy. You don't suspect any harm. I don't suspect anything more than I know, William, returns the other gravely. And what do you know? Urges Mr. Guppy. I know 3 things. First, I know that here we are whispering in secrecy, a pair of conspirators. Well, says Mr. Guppy, and we had better be that than a pair of noodles, which we should be if we were doing anything else, for it's the only way of doing what we want to do. Secondly, it's not made out to me how it's likely to be profitable after all. Mr. Guppy casts his eyes at the portrait of Lady Dedlock over the mantel-shelf and replies, Tony, you are asked to leave that to the honour of your friend. Besides, it's being calculated to serve that friend. Your friend is no fool. What's that? It's 11 o'clock striking by the bell of St. Paul's. Listen, and you'll hear the bells in the city jangling. Both sat silent, listening to the metal voices, near and distant, resounding from towers of various heights, in tones more various than their situations. When these at length cease, all seems more mysterious and quiet than before. One disagreeable result of whispering is that it seems to evoke an atmosphere of silence haunted by the ghosts of sound. Strange cracks and tickings, the rustling of garments that have no substance in them, the tread of dreadful feet that would leave no mark on the sea sand or the winter snow. So sensitive the 2 friends happen to be that the air is full of these phantoms, and the 2 look over their shoulders by one constant to see that the door is shut. Yes, Tony, says Mr. Guppy, drawing nearer to the fire and biting his unsteady thumbnail. You were going to say thirdly? It's far from a pleasant thing to be plotting about a dead man in the room where he died, especially when you happen to live in it. But we are plotting nothing against him, Tony. Maybe not. Still, I don't like it. Live here by yourself and see how you like it. As to dead men, Tony, proceeds Mr. Guppy, evading this proposal, there have been dead men in most rooms. I know there have. But in most rooms you let them alone, and they let you alone, Tony answers. The two look at each other again. Mr. Guppy makes a hurried remark to the effect that they may be doing the deceased a service. But he hopes so. There is an oppressive blank until Mr. Weevely is stirred by stirring the fire suddenly makes Mr. Guppy start. Fa! Here's more of this hateful soot hanging about, says he. Let us open the window a bit and get a mouthful of air. It's too close. He raises the sash, and they both rest on the windowsill, half in and half out of the room. The neighboring houses are too near to admit of their seeing any sky without craning their necks and looking up, but lights in frowsy windows here and there, and the rolling of distant carriages, and the new expression that there is of the stir of men they find to be comfortable. Mr. Guppy, noiselessly tapping on the windowsill, resumes his whispering in quite a light comedy tone. By the by, Tony, don't forget old Smallweed, meaning the younger of that name. I have not let him into this, you know. That grandfather of his is too keen by half. It runs in the family. I remember, said Tony. I am up to all that. As to Crook, resumes Mr. Guppy, now do you suppose he really has got hold of any other papers of importance, as he has boasted to you since you have been allies? Tony shakes his head. I don't know. Can't imagine. If we get through this business without rousing his suspicions, I shall be better informed, no doubt. How can I know without seeing them, when he don't know himself? He is always spelling out words from them, and chalking them over the shop wall, and asking what this is and what that is, but his whole stock from beginning to end may easily be the waste paper he bought as is, for anything I can say. It's a monomania with him to think he is possessed of documents. How did he first come by the idea, though? That's the question, Mr. Guppy suggests. He may have found papers in something he bought, where papers were not supposed to be, and may have got it into his shrewd head, from the manner and place of their concealment, that they are worth something. Or he may have taken in some pretended bargain, or he may have muddled altogether by long staring at whatever he has got, and by drink and by hanging about the Lord Chancellor's court, and hearing of documents forever, returns Mr. Weevily. Mr. Guppy, sitting on the window-sill, nodding his head and balancing all these possibilities in his mind, continues thoughtfully to tap it and clasp it, and measure it with his hand until he hastily draws his hand away. What's in the devil's name? What in the devil's name, he says, is this? Look at my fingers. A thick yellow liquor defiles them, which is offensive to the touch and sight, and more offensive to the smell, a stagnant, sickening oil, with some natural repulsion in it that makes them both shudder. What have you been doing here? What have you been pouring out of window? I pouring out of window? Nothing, I swear. Never since I have been here, cries the lodger. And look here, when he brings the candle here from the corner of the window-sill, it slowly drips and creeps away down the bricks. Here it lies in a little thick, nauseous pool. This is a horrible house, says Mr. Guppy, shutting down the window. Give me some water, or I shall cut my hand off. So he washes and rubs and scrubs and smells and washes, that he has not long restored himself with a glass of brandy when St. Paul's bell strikes 12, and all those other bells strike 12 from their towers of various heights in the dark air, and in their many tones. When all is quiet again, the lodger says, It's the appointed time at last. Shall I go? Mr. Guppy nods and gives him a lucky touch on the back, but not with the washed hand, though it is his right hand. He goes downstairs, and Mr. Guppy tries to compose himself before the fire, waiting for a long time. But in no more than a minute or two, the stairs creak, and Tony comes swiftly back. Have you got them? Got them? No, the old man's not there. He has been so horribly frightened in that short interval that his terror seizes the other, who makes a rush at him and asks loudly, What's the matter? I couldn't make him hear, and I softly opened the door and looked in, and the burning smell is there, and the soot is there, and the oil is there, and he is not there. Tony ends this with a groan. Mr. Guppy takes the light. They go down, more dead than alive, and holding one another, push open the door of the back shop. The cat has retreated close to it and stands snarling at them as something on the ground before the fire. And stands snarling, not at them, at something on the ground before the fire. There is very little fire left in the grate, but there is a smoldering, suffocating vapor in the room, and a dark, greasy coating on the walls and ceiling. The chairs and table and the bottle, so rarely absent from the table, all stand as usual. On one chair back hang the old man's hairy cap and coat. "Look," whispers the lodger, pointing his friend's attention to these objects with a trembling finger. "I told you so. When I saw him last, he took his cap off, took out the little bundle of old letters, hung his cap on the back of the chair. His coat was there already, for he had pulled that off before. He went to put the shutters up, and I left him, turning the letters over in his hand, standing just where that crumbled black thing is upon the floor." "Is he hanging somewhere?" They look up. "No." "See," whispers Tony. At the foot of the same chair there lies a dirty bit of thin red cord that they tie up pens with, that went round the letters. He undid it slowly, leering and laughing at me, before he began to turn them over, and threw it there. I saw it fall. "What's the matter with the cat?" says Guppy. "Look at her. Mad, I think, and no wonder in this evil place." They advance slowly, looking at all these things. The cat remains where they found her, still snarling at something on the ground, before the fire and between the two chairs. "What is it? Hold up the light." Here is a small burnt patch of flooring. Here is the tinder from the little bundle of burnt papers that is not so light as usual, seeming to be steeped in something. And here it is, the cinder of a small charred and broken log of wood sprinkled with white ashes. Or is it coal? Or horror? Horror, he is here. And this from which we run away, striking out the light and overturning one another into the street, is all that represents him. "Help! Help! Come into this house, for heaven's sake!" Plenty will come, but none can help. The Lord Chancellor of the court, true to his title, in his last act has died the death of all Lord Chancellors in all courts, and of all authorities in all places under his names, soever where false pretenses are made, and where injustice is done. Call the death by any name your highness will, attribute to whom you will, or say it might have been prevented how you will. It is the same death, entirely inborn, inbred, engendered, and corrupted humors of the vicious body itself, that only spontaneous combustion and none other of all the deaths that can be died. And that is the end of chapter 32.